Hey, howdy guys, this is Dave, and welcome back to Warriors! True Stories of Combat Skill and Courage by Jim Eldridge. We're riding directly into 1485 AD, Knights in Armor, the War of the Roses. Knights were traditionally young men from titled families. The path to being a knight was in 3 stages. First, a boy from an aristocratic family with a talent for fighting became a page at about the age of 7. As a page, he learned how to ride a horse properly and how to use various weapons. Although at this stage, weapons were made of wood or their sharp edges were blunted. Next, the page became a squire to a knight. This usually happened at about 14 years of age. It was the squire's job to help his knight get ready for battle and to fight alongside his knight. After 4 or 5 years of battle experience as a squire, when about 18 years old, the squire could become a knight and could carry his own coat of arms on his shield. Okay, so the hardware is just getting way more intense, so you can definitely pause that if you want to read any of this. Okay, here's the history behind the story. The Plantagenets had ruled England since 1154. At the end of the 14th century, the Plantagenet Richard II was deposed and later murdered by Henry IV, who became the first of the Lancaster kings. After Henry IV came his son, Henry V, and when he died, his 1-year-old son, Henry VI, officially became king. However, as he grew older, Henry VI proved to be a weak king, and in his 30s he began to suffer bouts of insanity. During his reign, law and order in England broke down. Henry VI lavished fortunes on his favorites, and to pay for his royal spending, taxes were increased, which led to uprisings. These were brutally suppressed. Soon, the rival branches of the royal family, the Yorks and the Lancasters, were battling over who would gain control of the king and of the royal purse. The Lancastrians were being led by Henry VI's French wife, Margaret of Anjou, a much more powerful figure than her weak husband, and by the Duke of Somerset. The Yorkists were led by Richard, Duke of York, who until 1455 had been Lord Protector of England and heir to the throne, backed by the powerful Neville family, led by the Earl of Warwick. In 1455, the feud between the Lancasters and the Yorkists broke into open warfare with the Battle of St. Albans, which the Yorkists won. However, Henry VI held on to the throne. For the next 3 decades, England was in a state of civil war, as first one side, then the other gained ascendancy. This became known as the War of the Roses. Richard, Duke of York, died in 1460. In 1461, following a Yorkist victory at the Battle of Towtown, Richard's son, Edward, deposed Henry VI and declared himself King Edward IV. In 1470, following Lancastrian victories, Henry VI was restored to the throne, but was murdered in 1471. Once again, Edward IV became king, until his death in 1483. His brother, Richard III, then took over the throne. By 1485, there was a new head of the House of Lancaster, Henry Tudor. He had spent most of his life in exile in Wales and Brittany, along with many other members of the Lancaster family. Now he was determined to come to England with his troops and try to take control of the crown, and try to take the crown of England away from the Yorkists. We may not know the exact details of what happened, but the great battle and characters in this story are all true. Curse Henry Tudor. May he die a beggar's death, and the rats feast on his body. King Richard III of England paced around the royal chamber, his hand crumpling the sheet of paper that had brought him the bad news. Henry Tudor had landed in Wales some days ago and was already making his way through North Wales, heading for the border with England. This upstart has been in Wales for days already! Days! Why did no one tell me of this coming before? I was told he was still hiding in France. Do we not have spies? What do we pay them for? John Howard, Duke of Norfolk, watched his king as he raged. Then he replied calmly, Unfortunately, Henry has many supporters in Wales. However, I believe his army is small. He has brought 3,000 men with him from France. An army of that size can be crushed easily. But what of the men that will join him on his way? Demanded Richard. His army could be 10,000 strong by the time he reaches London. Norfolk shook his head. Many of the lords are wary of joining Henry at this stage, he said. Our spies tell us that most of them plan to wait and see what will happen between you and Henry before they decide who they will support. Don't talk to me about your spies, stormed Richard. They didn't even know that Henry had landed in Wales. He paced, thinking over what Norfolk had said. He knew it had a grain of truth in it. He knew he was unpopular among many of the lords, but he also knew that they were afraid of him. The many executions he had carried out for treason since he had taken the throne had made them all watch their words. They'll stand aside and support the one who wins, spat Richard at last. They are cowards all. He made a decision. We will raise our army and go meet this upstart, this pretender to the throne, on the field of battle before he has a chance to increase the size of his army. I will cut his head off and put it on a spike outside the palace. Then everyone will know what happens to those who try to take the throne of England. Henry Tudor, Duke of Richmond, sat outside his tent and thought about the battle that was to come. Elsewhere in the camp, his army was going about its business, eating, drinking, and preparing weapons while he made his plans. Now that his campaign was actually underway, Henry couldn't help but feel a sense of fear. This would be his first real battle. So far, his fighting experience as a knight had been in minor campaigns, small skirmishes. The battle to come would test him to the limit. Not just his courage and his fighting skills, but his ability to lead. He had 3,500 men. 3,000 had landed with him from France. The other 500 had joined him on his march through Wales, and then east towards Shropshire. Henry was disappointed. He had hoped for more. He needed more. Richard had an army of 10,000 at his disposal, with more if the lords joined him. The lords were the key to this campaign. If they supported him, then Henry would win. If they gave their support to Richard, then Richard would win. So far, most of them were doing nothing, just waiting. Had he made a mistake in launching this attack? Henry wondered. He had been promised support by Rise ap Thomas, the Welsh lord, but so far there had been no sign of any men. Is there any word yet from Lord Stanley, Henry? Asked a voice. Henry turned. His army chief in command, Lord Oxford, had appeared. It was a relief to Henry to have a seasoned battle campaigner and warrior like Oxford at his side. Henry shook his head. No, he said. I expect he waits to see what happens. He always was a careful man. A careful and powerful one, added Oxford. Lord Thomas Stanley was Henry's stepfather. Henry had written to his mother, begging her to get her husband to support him in his quest. He had survived the War of the Roses this long time by switching sides, each time choosing the more powerful, the new victor. He had built up his own army into one of the most powerful in England. There was no way of knowing which side Lord Stanley would support when it came to the battle. We are outnumbered, Oxford, said Henry with a heartfelt sigh. I calculate that Richard has a 2-to-1 advantage over us, at the very least. Numbers are not always the most important factor, said Oxford. He gestured at the camp, at the row of tents that had been put up around them. The men we have are dedicated to our cause. The mercenaries are dedicated to the money, said Henry ruefully. Oxford nodded in reluctant agreement. Henry's force was made up of 500 English exiles, dedicated to the Lancastrian cause, 1,500 French soldiers, and 1,000 mercenaries, mostly Scots. But they are professional soldiers, Oxford pointed out. They will fight well, and I believe more will join us. They had better, said Henry moodily. There is more than just the crown at stake. There is the whole future of England. Richard III, King of England, rode north. Beside him, astride their magnificent horses, were his lieutenants, John Howard, Duke of Norfolk, and Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland. Behind them, also on horseback, came their squires and pages. Some on horse, some on foot, came the soldiers. An army 10,000 strong, marching north along the old Roman road. Another 5,000 soldiers were on their way from the north to join them. They were nearing Northampton now. Richard wondered how long it would be before they came upon Henry's army. According to his spies, Henry and his troops were camped in Shrewsbury, just barely into England from across the Welsh border. Some of the Welsh lords had now joined Henry, but not enough to make Henry's army into a threat. "Which way will Lord Stanley jump, John?" Richard asked his aide. The Duke fell silent while he thought it over. Then he said, "I think he will either join us or stay out of the battle. But Henry is my stepson," Richard pointed out, "and Henry's mother, Margaret Beaufort, is a strong-willed woman who rides roughshod over her menfolk. I doubt she will ride roughshod over Thomas Stanley," said the Duke. "He is too careful of keeping his head on his shoulders. He is also very careful with his money. He would not risk being part of a campaign that would cost him dearly either way. The people will not support this Henry Tudor," put in Northumberland. "His claim to the throne is too thin. He is just another bastard of the illegitimate line of John, Edward III's son. That is no basis for kingship." Richard fell silent, reflecting that at one time his own claim to the throne had also been thin. Richard's brother Edward had become king, following the overthrow of that puny weakling, Henry VI. After Edward had died, there had been other claimants to the throne. Edward's young son, for example. At 12 years old, he had been too young to take over the crown, so Richard had taken command of the throne as Lord Protector on the boy's behalf. Later, the boy had been murdered, as had his younger brother, Prince Richard. There were rumors that Richard had ordered their murders. There had also been Richard's brother, the Duke of Clarence, who had been killed on Richard's orders, and Clarence's children declared illegitimate to bar them from the throne. Richard knew that these many deaths of people so close to him had helped make him feared and unpopular. But fear helped keep people in their place. When he defeated this pretender, this Henry Tudor, and destroyed his army, he would do it in a way that would make everyone fear him even more. "Rain," groaned Henry, as his army trudged its way over muddy roads. "Rain, which makes weapons slippery and difficult to hold, which makes the ground wet and hard to keep a firm grip on when fighting. This rain will be the ruin of us," he grumbled to Oxford. Oxford shook his head. "Rain is a leveler," he said. "It will make it as hard for Richard's troops." "A curse on Richard," scowled Henry. "He has much to pay for. He has killed many of our own families, and enough of his own side to give him enough enemies to outnumber him by thousands. Why are they not with us?" "They are afraid," said Oxford. "They know that those who oppose Richard die." Tentatively, Oxford asked, "Still no word from your stepfather?" Henry shook his head. "No word from him, nor his brother William." He sighed. "If we only had their 2 armies with us, we would be so much stronger than Richard's army, even with the addition of the army of the Welsh lord, Rise ap Thomas. Their force only numbered just over 5,000, with reports coming in of Richard's army being 12,000 and even 15,000 strong. The odds against them were great indeed." "Where is Richard's army now?" asked Henry. "According to our scouts, he has made camp just east of Leicester, outside a village called Market Bosworth," replied Oxford. "We will be there by nightfall." "So, tomorrow, we fight," nodded Oxford. August 22nd, 1485. Bosworth Field. Dawn. Richard III stood in his command tent, musing on the coming battle, as his squire and page dressed him in his armor. First the leather doublet, then the chainmail, and then, piece by piece, the steel plates to protect his legs, his body, his arms, his feet, his hands, his shoulders, leaving no link for a stray arrow to penetrate. Then his weapons, the sword heavy in its scabbard, hanging from his luxuriously decorated leather belt, a dagger in a smaller scabbard. Finally, his helmet was put in place. Richard stood before the mirror held by his page and saw his own reflection. He knew he was every inch the knight, the warrior king. "Open the velvet bag in my box," he ordered to his squire. The squire did so and revealed a crown adorned with jewels, a king's crown. The squire placed it on Richard's head, fitting it over the crown of his master's helmet. Richard looked at his reflection once more in the mirror. Yes, now he was the warrior king. The curtains of his tent parted, and the Duke of Norfolk entered and bowed. "The enemy are gathered, sire," he said. "How large is Henry's army?" asked Richard. "Our spies were right, about 5,000 men. Our forces outnumbered them 3-1. "So Lord Stanley is not with them," said Richard, pleased. The uncomfortable look that came into Norfolk's face made Richard frown. "Or do you have news about Lord Stanley?" he asked suspiciously. "Lord Stanley and his army are also on the field, as is the army of his brother, William Stanley. They have 4,000 men with them." "Treason!" raged Richard. "They dare to rise against their king!" Norfolk shook his head. "They say they will take no part in the battle on either side," said Norfolk. "Then why are they here?" demanded Richard. "And in such force?" "If their past record is anything to go by, it is to see who is winning, and then join on the winning side and take their share of the spoils," said Norfolk. Richard nodded. "The Stanleys are nothing but parasites and criminals," he scowled. Grudgingly, he added, "But we need them to stay out of the fight. If they come in on Henry's side, it could put us at risk." He shook his head in disgust. "There is treachery everywhere, Norfolk. A king cannot trust anyone these days." A few miles away, Henry Tudor and Lord Oxford watched as their commanders assembled their troops on the western side of Bosworth Field. From this distance, they could see that Richard's army had already taken the higher ground of Ambion Hill. At the front of Richard's troops was a contingent of archers on foot. Behind them, on horseback, were at least 2,000 men in armor, their weapons gleaming in the early light of the morning sun's rays. On either side of the hill, running from the ridge at the top of the marshy ground at the bottom, were lines of cannons, about 150 on each side. Chains could be seen fixing each cannon to the next cannon, making an explosive defensive fence to stop riders attacking from the sides of the hill. Stretching up to the top of the hill, behind the archers and the mounted horsemen, were many thousands more men in armor, some on horseback, some on foot. All were armed with lances, pike staffs, and swords. And to one side, the mounted armies of Lord Thomas Stanley and his brother, William Stanley, like spectators at a game. "Your stepfather is here," commented Lord Oxford dryly. "But whether to support me or to oppose me depends on how we do," said Henry. And for the first time, he gave a grin of amusement at his situation. The shouts of command from Henry's side were continuing in English, French, Gaelic, and Welsh, as the different troops were ordered into battle formation by their commanders. "We will have to be the ones to attack," said Oxford. "I know," nodded Henry in agreement. "May I have the honor of leading the attack?" asked Oxford. Henry looked for a moment as if he were going to argue. Then he nodded. "I would be honored for you to take that role," he said. "You are more experienced in battle. I would hate to make a grave mistake so early in the day and lose us the whole battle before it has barely begun. How will you proceed?" Oxford studied the ranks of Richard's army from a distance, and then pointed out the cannons. The cannons that Richard has placed for the protection of his troops could also be their undoing. They narrow their front, cutting down the number of men who could attack us. At the same time, the chains prevent their troops from breaking out and attacking us down the sides of the hill. Also, it is difficult to fire a cannon down a hill. I shall attack from all 3 sides of the hill at once. Richard's archers will account for many of our men. Then we will have to see what we can do with the rest, said Oxford. By now the sun had risen higher in the sky. Morning was well underway. The battle lines were now complete and ready, waiting. Henry held out his mailed hand and shook Oxford's gauntlet. Good luck, he said, and may God give us victory on this day. To King Henry, said Oxford. Then he wheeled his horse and rode toward the front of the assembled troops. From their position on top of the hill, Richard and Norfolk watched as Oxford split Henry Tudor's troops into 3 groups and spread them across the base of the hill. 2 of the groups moved to the sides of the hill, directly beneath Richard's 2 lines of cannons. Oxford stayed at the head of the middle group, now directly beneath Richard's position. Surely Oxford cannot mean to launch an attack so soon, queried Richard. And where is Henry? I see him with the troops at the rear, said Norfolk. Ha! Hiding, spat Richard scornfully. A sudden roar went up from the troops at Henry's front line, and then they were rushing up the hill, Oxford at their head on his charger, waving his sword. We have begun, growled Richard. With that he raised his own sword and yelled, Forward! Fire the cannons! Richard was just about to urge his own horse down the slope toward the battle, but Norfolk stopped him. Not yet, sire, he appealed. You think I am afraid? Demanded Richard angrily. Norfolk shook his head. I know you are not. But an unlucky arrow at this early stage, Richard growled. I am king. I lead my troops. I do not hide behind them like Henry Tudor. With that, Richard pulled down the visor of his helmet, and with a cry of, Richard! He dug his knees into his horse's side and urged it down the hill. Norfolk groaned ruefully, and then followed his king, his own sword swinging heavily in his metalled fist. As Oxford had predicted, the cannons at each side of the hill were having problems. Their shots fired into the air, over the heads of Henry's advancing soldiers. Damage was done to Henry's soldiers at the rear of the column, but already the vanguard were at the chains that held the cannons and were deep in hand-to-hand fighting, swords flying and chopping, pikes and lances thrusting. Oxford and his troops, attacking at the central part of the hill, were also making headway. In the rear of his lines of soldiers waiting in reserves, Henry gritted his teeth impatiently. This was no way for a king to behave, lurking and hiding. Whatever Oxford said, now was his time. Already he could see Richard swooping down on his great horse, the jeweled crown on his helmet clear for all to see. Henry turned to his squire. Go to Lord Stanley, he said urgently. Tell him our plan is succeeding, and that I will now face Richard myself. And after my victory, I hope to be able to call him my friend. As his squire rode off toward the armies of the Stanleys, Henry smiled to himself at his choice of words. I hope to be able to call him my friend. A politician like Lord Stanley would know only too well what Henry meant. If you do not bring in your soldiers on my side now, you are not my friend. And if you are not my friend, you are my enemy. By now Henry could see that Richard was in the thick of the battle, his sword laying about him on all sides. Richard was fighting like a man possessed, a man with everything to lose. And I, thought Henry, as he pulled down the visor of his helmet and urged his horse forward, am a man with everything to gain. A loud cheer went up from Henry's troops as they saw their champion entering the battle. Swords raised, his armor burnished in the sunlight that was now breaking through the clouds. Richard heard the cheer and took a moment to look toward the sound, and saw Henry racing on his horse toward him. Good, he thought, at last. This is the way it should be. Warrior against warrior. Richard wheeled his horse and headed toward the oncoming Henry, cutting a swath through the battle with a flashing sword, riding down those who stood in his way beneath the hooves of his horse. The battle was now in full flood, the clash of weapons against armor, sword against shield. The air was filled with the screams of the wounded and the dying. Richard chopped down with his sword at a soldier who tried to rush at him with a spear, hacking the end off the spear with his downward blow, and then dispatching the soldier with his return blow, upward and outward. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw what he had dreaded. Lord Stanley and his brother had brought their armies into the fray and were attacking Richard's men. "Traitors!" he roared. "I will have you gutted!" Suddenly, he felt his horse stagger. As he looked, he saw a French soldier had thrust a pike deep into his horse. Richard swayed in the saddle, and then his horse crumpled beneath him, throwing Richard as it crashed into the earth. "Richard is down!" went up the cry. "Richard lives!" Richard shouted as he staggered to his feet, hampered by the weight of his armor. A glancing blow hit him in the back, and he stumbled, then turned and hacked with his sword at the man who had hit him. A shadow fell over him, and he looked up to see Henry Tudor astride his horse, sword raised. Moving as fast as his armor would allow him, Richard snatched up a fallen pike and thrust it up toward Henry. Henry swayed in his saddle to avoid Richard's thrust, and then brought down his sword but missed, the blade clanging harmlessly off Richard's armor. Another thrust by Richard with a long pike staff hit Henry full in the chest, and Henry tumbled backward, crashing to the ground in a smashing of metal against metal. Henry's horse whinnied and reared, and then backed away. Henry hauled himself to his feet, his sword still held in his hand. Richard tossed the pike staff aside and flexed his own sword. "At least, Henry Tudor, you will die like a man," snarled Richard, and he lashed out at Henry. Henry brought his own sword up and deflected Richard's blow with it, the clang of metal ringing out. Again Richard attacked, the force of his blows forcing Henry back. At this time, his blade smashed down on Henry's armor, but though his flailing sword crashed and banged and bruised Henry, it could not find a gap in the metal protection. Henry retreated, giving further ground against Richard's blows, and then, as Richard gave one last swinging downward blow, aimed at the top of Henry's helmet, Henry swayed to one side. The momentum of Richard's sword brought it crashing down, its blade sinking into the earth. In that second, Henry swung his sword in a mighty arc in a sideways move, the edge of his sword smashing into the elbow of Richard's sword arm, crumpling the elbow guard beneath it and driving it into the flesh of Richard's arm. Richard let out a yell of pain, and was cut short as Henry let fly with his sword again, this time catching Richard high in the chest. Richard tottered backward, then fell, dragged down by his armor. The crown fell off his helmet and rolled into the mud. Instantly, Henry snatched it up and held it aloft for all to see. "Richard is dead!" he roared. All those within earshot turned on hearing this. Then they saw the figure of Richard in his armor, now covered in mud, struggling to get up. "The king lives!" shouted one of Richard's soldiers. Henry put the crown on his own helmet, turned to the tower of Richard, raising his sword, and then he brought it down in one hard, crunching blow, and Richard lay still. Henry waited for Richard to move again, but there came no movement. By now a stillness had descended on the battle. The clanging of metal against metal had ceased. Now, Henry lifted the crown from his helmet and held it up. "Salute your king!" he shouted, and one by one the soldiers, those that were Henry's and those who had been Richard's, fell to their knees, and a cry went up across the battlefield. "Long live King Henry." So here's our rating system for these knights in armor. The code of honor is 5, ruthlessness is at a 6, weaponry's at a 3, tactics are at a 3, and courage is at a 5, and the points total at 22. I don't know what happened. I mean, this is happening later in time. The samurai honestly knew what was up. I wonder what would have happened if the samurai and the knights in armor were actually fighting. I bet the samurai would obliterate them. So far, the samurai are leading this with their 38 points. So we'll have to see what happens with the next warrior to see if they can even compare it all. And until that time, you guys, if you like what you heard here, please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. And until next time, have a good one.